The Habsburg Empire was once the brightest jewel in Europe's crown, an empire so powerful that it seemed eternal. Its palaces were carved in marble, its alliances sealed in gold, and its armies marched across the continent with a confidence that bordered on destiny. But behind the magnificence of the Habsburg throne, behind the candlelit halls and glittering crowns, there was a secret that everyone saw, everyone whispered about, yet no one dared challenge. The belief that their blood, their lineage, their very identity, could never be mixed with outsiders. A belief that would become the slow, silent architect of their own destruction. It began innocently. A marriage between cousins here, one between relatives there. After all, many royal families arranged marriages to strengthen alliances. But the Habsburgs elevated this practice to an extreme. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. Aunts married nephews. Bloodlines folded into themselves like a map creasing inward. Generation after generation, the family tree grew narrower, tighter, more twisted. What seemed harmless became habit, and what became habit soon turned into tradition so sacred that breaking it felt like sacrilege. Inside palace walls, celebrations masked the truth. Royal weddings were extravagant affairs. Musicians played in vaulted halls, tapestries shimmered under torchlight, and the world outside looked on with admiration. But beneath the jewels and silks, two children of the same bloodline were standing across from each other, joining not out of choice, not out of love, but out of a political strategy that ignored the quiet warnings of nature. Nature, however, does not remain silent forever. The first signs appeared subtly. A prince born with unusual features. A princess with a small deformity. A child who took too long to speak or walk. At first, these anomalies were dismissed. Perhaps the child was delicate. Perhaps the climate was to blame. Perhaps the physicians simply lacked skill. Convenient explanations protected the comfort of tradition. But as the decades rolled on, these inconveniences grew into undeniable patterns. The portraits painted in this era did not exaggerate. They revealed truth. You can see it in the eyes, the jaw, the length of the face, the unmistakable markers of a dynasty bending under its own weight. A long, protruding lower jaw, lips that seemed swollen, eyes that appeared heavy and sunken, faces that seemed to collapse inward and outward at the same time. And what the world saw as peculiar family features were actually the fingerprints of centuries of inbreeding. Children struggled with illnesses no medicine could cure. Some were born so sick they never took their first steps. Some could not speak clearly their entire lives. Some had hearts that beat too fast, others too slow. Some lived with constant pain. And yet, each generation repeated the same choices, binding themselves tighter to their own blood. The Habsburgs believed they were preserving their legacy. But with each marriage, they were unknowingly carving the path toward their downfall. And as the 17th century approached, the consequences grew darker, more dramatic, and far more inescapable. The empire, once held together by strategic marriages, began to crack under the very weight of those unions. Yet no one could foresee that all of this, the centuries of marriages, decisions, traditions, and beliefs, would converge into the body of one final heir. One fragile king who would become the living symbol of the empire's long-hidden curse. His name was Charles, and he would be the last. Charles II of Spain entered the world under the golden ceilings of the royal palace, but his arrival did not bring joy, only fear. The midwives exchanged anxious looks. The queen's attendants fell silent, and the whispers began before the child even made a sound. He was frail, almost frighteningly so. His head appeared too large for his tiny, weakened body. His eyes, though open, seemed distant. His limbs were shockingly thin. And his jaw, heavy, elongated, unmistakably Habsburg, already struggled to close. As an infant, Charles would cry endlessly, not out of hunger but because his mouth could barely latch. His tongue, swollen and unwieldy, made feeding a daily battle. The doctors examined him over and over, each time offering no clear solution. His mother cried in private. The empire demanded an heir, but nature had delivered a warning. Still Charles survived, barely. As he grew, so did the signs of the dynasty's collapse. At age 4 he could not walk. At age 8, he stumbled through his first steps, his balance unsteady, his body too fragile for the royal garments he wore. He struggled to speak clearly, every word caught between his misaligned jaws. His tutors attempted lessons, but Charles often stared blankly, confused by letters and numbers that others his age mastered with ease. Inside the court, political factions grew desperate. Spain needed a strong ruler, a symbol of power. Instead, they had a boy who spent days bedridden, fighting infection after infection. His teeth barely met, making chewing nearly impossible. Meals took hours. He tired quickly. His back hunched. His hair thinned. His body seemed at war with itself every single day. And yet, despite his weakness, Charles was crowned king. He became the frail monarch of a kingdom built through centuries of ruthless ambition. Foreign ambassadors wrote shocked reports. They described his condition with a mixture of horror and pity. One ambassador wrote, "The king is incapable of ruling, incapable of standing for long, incapable of producing an heir." Another simply said, "Spain is ruled by a miracle." But miracles cannot last. As Charles grew older, the burden of centuries grew heavier. He was unable to produce children, putting immense pressure on his fading health. His first marriage was a disaster, filled with silent grief. His second marriage brought only sorrow. Both queens realized quickly that the king was too ill to continue the bloodline, too frail to fulfill his role, too damaged by the very blood he inherited. Meanwhile, Spain began collapsing. Wars were lost. Territories rebelled. The economy crumbled. Famine spread. The once great empire looked to its king for strength, but their king lay in dark chambers, breathing heavily, fighting fevers, drifting in and out of consciousness. Rumors spread among the people. They whispered that he was cursed, that witches had placed spells on the throne. Priests performed exorcisms. Doctors bled him, purged him, treated him with every remedy known to their century. Nothing worked, because the cause of his suffering was not spiritual. It was not political. It was not supernatural. It was written in his blood. Generations of marriages within the same family had created him, the most inbred monarch ever recorded. Scientists today estimate that his genetic makeup was more concentrated than if he had been born to parents who were siblings. Charles II was not just a king. He was the final echo of a collapsing dynasty. And his death would be the moment the echo went silent forever. As the final years of Charles II's life approached, the palace grew darker, heavier, and more desperate. Courtiers fought for power behind closed doors, knowing the king had no heir. Foreign powers circled like vultures, waiting for Spain's inevitable collapse. And through all of this, Charles grew weaker by the day. His legs swelled painfully. His stomach distended. His breathing became a struggle. He often collapsed. Servants found him trembling on the floors of his chambers, unable to call for help. At night, he woke up gasping, his chest tight, his lungs failing. The man who should have led armies could barely stand without assistance. He prayed constantly, attended Mass daily. He believed God would deliver him from his suffering. But with each passing month, the truth became clearer. He was fading. His body, ravaged by the genetic weight of centuries, was surrendering. The empire watched helplessly. Ministers wrote frantic letters. Noble families plotted alliances. His queen sat beside him, tears hidden behind a calm face. She cared for him deeply, but she could see the end approaching long before the kingdom accepted it. Charles grew thinner and thinner. His jaw sagged, making speech difficult. His eyes lost their brightness. His skin turned pale, almost wax-like. And in those final months, everyone in the palace understood that the end of Charles meant the end of the dynasty. In October of 1700, the king could no longer rise from bed. Priests surrounded him. The corridors outside were silent. Courtiers stood waiting, holding their breath. And on a cold evening, the last male Habsburg of Spain, physically broken, emotionally tormented, spiritually exhausted, closed his eyes for the final time. He was only 39 years old. His death was not just a personal tragedy. It was the death of an era. The throne he left behind was empty. The bloodline ended. The empire splintered. Wars broke out. Europe plunged into chaos. And the world at last realized that the Habsburgs, once the most powerful dynasty on earth, had destroyed themselves with their own traditions. Not by rebellion, not by assassination, not by war, but by insisting for centuries that only a Habsburg could marry a Habsburg. Their greatest strength had become their silent killer. And in the end, the empire that believed its blood was divine collapsed because that same blood had been slowly poisoned by the choices of those who believed they were above the laws of nature. An empire destroyed, not by enemies, but by the marriages meant to save it.